Hey, clever listeners. It's Amy. I have a quick announcement before we get started. We'd love for you to complete our listener survey. It's brief and easy, and the link is right in the episode's description. Clever is an independent podcast, entirely supported by sponsorships, advertising, and donations. I know ads can be annoying, but if you fill out the survey, it will help us work with advertisers that actually have something you may find valuable. And that makes it a win for you, a win for Clever, and a win for the sponsor. God, I love a trifecta of wins. So thank you in advance for filling out the survey. And again, the link is in the episode description.
I finally understood this thing that we do to be more so than just like, do I like this or do I not like this? It has purpose that hopefully lives on beyond my lifetime.
Hi, everyone. I'm Amy Devers, and this is Clever. Today, I'm talking to architect and toolmaker Federico Negro. Federico is the founder and CEO of Canoa, the first AI-assisted collaborative online tool for interior designers to create and share data-rich mood boards, layouts, and product schedules with their teams. A second-time founder, he began Canoa as a response to the design sector's failure to address current environmental issues. Technology and design have always been an early interest of his, and getting involved with disaster relief after Hurricane Katrina shifted his outlook on the industry's contribution to climate change. Having studied architecture at University of Illinois and Parsons, Federico got his professional legs under him at Shop Architects before starting his first company, Case, which focused on developing design technologies for built environment businesses. Case was acquired by WeWork in 2015, and Federico assumed the role of WeWork's global head of design. During this time, he led the effort to launch into 30 countries and open over 500 locations, growing his team to over 2,000 individuals. He also became acutely aware of the end-to-end challenges businesses face when dealing with specifying furnishings, fixtures, and equipment, or FF&E. More than $250 million per year in FF&E procurement later, he decided it was time to start working on the tool designers have always wanted, and Canoa was born. Additionally, Federico has been a returning speaker at Harvard GSD, leading seminars focused on entrepreneurship and architecture, and has been featured in many publications, including the Architect's newspaper, Metropolis magazine, and Wired UK, among others. What's fascinating about Federico is his alacrity with toolmaking, which in my opinion is the height of creative agency. Rather than alienation from creative labor, which can so often happen when one is siloed into a single aspect of creation, toolmaking involves big-picture whole systems thinking, profound intimacy with the process, and empathy with the practitioner. Logical and sensitive qualities that, as you'll hear, reverberate throughout his character. Here's Federico.
My name is Federico Negro. I'm based out of Brooklyn, New York. I'm a designer and currently as the founder of Canoa, which is design software. But I like to define what I do as building tools to design. I'm a toolmaker and I love it.
You are speaking straight to my heart. My background is in furniture design, and to do what we do, we have to build jigs and our own tools. And I mean, that's a very sort of analog way of that I came to my love of tool making, but it's the ultimate agency when you can not just use tools, but make your own tools, then you can make anything. So
that's right.
It's incredibly empowering in the material world, in the digital world, in any world, is learning to make tools. So that's a pretty exciting place to be. But before we get to the current tool that you're excited about, let's go all the way back to Uruguay and talk to me about where you were born, what your family dynamic was like, your hometown, what little Federico was doing.
I'm actually there now.
Oh.
Yeah. So, I grew up in Uruguay. I moved around quite a bit as a kid because of my father's job. He was a chemical engineer, mostly worked in the food industry. And I'd say a lot of engineering in my family. And then my mother was very much into the arts. She was a literature professor.
Hmm.
So maybe a good balance of the two, if you will.
Right brain, left brain
Mm-hmm.
in full force. We've got a literary professor and a chemical engineer. And how many siblings?
There's four of us total.
Four. Okay. And what were you interested in as a kid?
Well, I love drawing. That was sort of my safe space. I would always go back and sketch and draw. If I could have just be drawing forever, I probably would have been really happy. Unfortunately, I was born in 1980, and it was still a
Mm-hmm.
time when I think if you wanted to say something like, oh, I want to be an illustrator or something like that, they're like, well, you should go into a real career.
Yes.
Because,
Familiar. Hard same.
yes, because drawing pictures is, and so I thought a little bit about things like animation and things like that. And I sort of gravitated to any field that had this sort of wonderful combination of of course creativity, but that sort of expression that comes through the use of our hands.
Mm.
And I, maybe without knowing it, began to gravitate to maybe what later on I became more familiar with it being sort of called like the concept of craft,
Mm.
which I think to this day is something that I'm super passionate about. Yeah, and it all started with drawing and sketching for sure. I was a pretty good student. I would get bored easily. And so I would end up doodling and doing those kinds of things. And, math, sciences, all of these topics. Like I wasn't like good or bad at them. I think I was actually a pretty good student overall. But I didn't feel super engaged in those things in the way that I was with say like reading stories and of course like drawing and sketching and inventing things and inventing characters and all of these kinds of things, and that to me really took hold.
Where are you in the birth order with your siblings?
I'm the youngest.
You're the youngest.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And at some point you emigrated and landed in Chicago, and this was still during the civic military dictatorship. So I really am curious about what that experience was like for you. Was that during your teenage years that you emigrated?
Yeah, so actually the timing is that Uruguay was under dictatorship from about 73 to 82, 83.
Okay. Okay. So it was over.
Yeah, my parents actually immigrated to Venezuela during that time, which was a little bit of very different from today. It was a bit of a, let's say, safe place for a bunch of expats in the region because Chile, of course, was undergoing a similar period. So was Argentina. And so the southern cone of South America, which is really where I'm from, was in dire straits at the moment. In 84, we as a family moved back. We actually moved to Argentina for a couple of years, and then we moved back to Uruguay once the military government had been replaced, and then so we sort of were able to come back around, if you will. But my parents will describe it as a like a lost decade and a half. Once back in Uruguay, then in '94, my father was offered a position within the company he worked for. He worked for a subsidiary of an American company that was headquartered in Chicago. Because he worked in grains, that company was headquartered near the grains exchange in Chicago, and we moved up there.
Okay. That's a lot of moving around.
Yeah, four countries by the age of 14.
Yeah. Tell me a little bit more about being 14 years old and being thrust into a new country, new language. I mean, those are typically the awkward years. A lot of things are coming online in your body, but like you're also social circles are kind of really important because you need peers to help navigate this challenging time. And you, like, how are you finding your way? Because that feels like survival skills.
Yeah, maybe that's a good way to put it, is you sort of have to learn to adapt.
Mm-hmm.
The good side of it is that, well, of course, everything's trial and error. You have no idea
Right, right.
what you're doing or whether what you're doing is okay or it's not. But you sort of learn as you go. It's definitely trial by fire from that perspective. And maybe a lot of those things that we feel as teenagers, sort of that apprehension, that embarrassment, and these kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
You're so way past all of those things because it's like, well. I remember, in my first days there, I had of course taken English, but it was always English as a second language. And it was usually taught in the countries I'd lived in, it was taught by either English speakers from Britain, so like Irish or Scottish, and so I not only did I have poor English, even the English that I had was with like a Scottish accent, and so and
Oh, this
so
is amazing picture you're painting right now. Wow.
and so I landed in Chicago, and I had to adapt quickly, and luckily it's one of those things where you hear this from many immigrants, I think, but like watching TV and like music videos and all those kinds of things, you just like you practice and you practice and you practice and you listen and you listen and you listen, and you begin to hone in on that enunciation, that accent, all of those things, which also in Chicago, it's like a very specific.
I'm from the Midwest.
There you go. And so I think I just caught it at the exact right moment where my brain was still maybe mushy enough, where picking up that second language just was pretty swift.
Okay. That's helpful.
Yeah. And it was, it was up, but it was also like intentional, right? I was just like, I need to figure this out because otherwise I don't know how I'm going to make it. So every effort went to, oh, what did that person? And I would, when I would rewind the CD and like, what did they say? What did they say? And I would take notes and I would like try to transcribe music and all, just because I was really, really, really trying to study the language from that perspective. It was interesting. I didn't have any friends.
What an interesting way into a culture, though, like transcribing music. That's really cool, actually, because it's sort of like the poetry of youth and also includes slang and vernacular and cultural references. And so that's pretty smart. That's making your own tool right there.
Well, yeah, maybe. My mother used to say that, because of course in literature, translations are sort of a big topic of literature, and
sure, yeah,
whether they're accurate and they're not accurate. And I remember her saying all the time about how learning language through grammar is wrong and shouldn't be done, and that learning language should always be founded on a cultural foundation and not a grammatical foundation. And so I'm applying this logic way later. It's not something that came at the time, but I think that there is a lot of that, which is that there was a connection with the music that was that went well beyond, let's say, the U.S. in the mid '90s.
Mm-hmm.
Like Clinton era, Bush era, like Bush Senior, all this kind of stuff, like band, like all of like indie bands and all of this sort of grunge culture that was coming up.
Mm-hmm.
That was very much also in Latin America as well. So there was something that I felt like that cultural bridge was made. And so like somebody's like, oh, be listening to like Nirvana or something. It's like, well, Nirvana was becoming this global thing, and I could sort of latch on to both sides of that conversation. One of them was like, okay, what is it that they're talking about? What is it that they're in a way sort of rebelling against? How are they saying it?
Mm-hmm.
What language are they using? Why are they feeling the way that they are? And as a teenager, being able to, to sort of tap into that early MTV years, all of these kinds of things, that all of that stuff was super, super helpful.
Yeah. So I'm going to take a guess that you were kind of always interested in architecture, but it also appealed to you because it's the creative practice that's also very engineering-ish. Did this factor into your decision to study architecture?
Yeah, I think so. Or I should say yes. There was something that really attracted me about the permanence of it. The sort of idea that there are some professions out there that where you get to build something, to me was already fascinating. I was like that sort of creator thing, whether it's engineering, whether it's architecture, whether it's art, like just creating something new is fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
And then, beyond that, it was this sort of, tie into history, tie into art, tie into my love of drawing and sketching, tie into this sort of like cultural overlay that, of course, architecture has such an impact on. And
well, and at this point in time, too, you'd also had firsthand experience of different cities' culture and how the architecture impacts social behavior and and everything. So you have like a pretty large sample of how architecture in the built world sort of impacts us.
Yeah, again, looking back on it, I think it's logical to make those connections. I think at the time maybe I didn't know how to make those connections, but yeah, like Montevideo is like an Art Nouveau city.
Mm-hmm.
Caracas is modernism gone
Yeah.
totally nuts. Buenos Aires, which I also lived in, is sort of like a mix of French colonial with like Spanish colonial with like a bunch of, let's say, Italian styles as well, and all of that. And so it's a mix for sure. So there's a lot of things happening that I don't think I could truly relate to. I don't think I had the language to express what that experience was giving me until probably after I went to architecture school, when I learned that these urban centers have size and we can measure them, and they were planned in some way or another, and they've gone through phases and layers. And I think all of that, I didn't really get it at the time, but I definitely felt attracted to it.
Yeah. You just go towards what you're gravitating towards, but you don't really know why. And then I think part of what's so fascinating to me is unpacking that these many years later and kind of understanding, oh, maybe it's because of those influences. Now that makes sense. But you got your bachelor's in architecture at University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Mm-hmm. And then did you go straight to your master's at the New School, Parsons?
So while I was at U of I became, oddly enough, U of I is a really strong engineering school. Mm-hmm. And it has a great architecture school, but it's very engineering oriented.
Yes, I'm familiar.
And so within all of that, they had a pretty wonderful architectural history set of courses. And I became pretty enthralled in that. Mm. Maybe that side of it was sort of really pulling me. And so they, everybody had these like study abroad programs and all of that. I ended up going to Italy and studying in Florence, taking real, let's say, detailed courses around everything from the Greeks all the way through the Romans, and then all the way into the Renaissance. And I just couldn't really get enough of it. I ended up going to work that same summer. So I went for a semester and then I stayed for the summer. I ended up going to work in Greece at an archaeological dig.
Oh, sorry, I just got really excited. Tell me about this.
All good. So I met this guy. I met this architect that in Italy. He ran the classics department at Middlebury College, and they had this program where they go and they're effectively doing a dig. And most of the people that went to this program, they were like, everybody who comes is a classics student. Do you want to come? And I was like, of course. Yeah. I would love to come. And this was like one of these defining moments, I think, in my early life, because I got to go. We were living on this like little town, maybe of like 500 people in the mountains of the Peloponnese. We would get up at like 5 o'clock in the morning. You had to work till like 10:30 at most, because then the heat was so bad that then you had to stop until 2 or 3 p.m. Then we worked later, and we were digging. And then my job, because I could draw, was to draw what are called as scarp drawings. And scarp drawings, you just sit there, you sketch out the elevations of the cut down on the earth, like every layer of dirt.
Okay.
And what you're finding, you have to document everything.
So it's sort of like a storyboard of the cross-section of the earth. Okay.
And you find, it's Greece, you find all kinds of things. Like every little hole that you make, there's just, here's pottery, and here's a coin, and here's this. And so we were in a small town called Ithome, which was this large sort of classical town. It had 3 or 4 temples. It had a theater. It had a gymnasium. It had all of these things. And there was like a German team digging, a Japanese team digging. There was a US team, and there was us. And we were focused on this one hero temple. And so part of the objective of the dig was to figure out how that temple was built. Because what was really interesting was that, so this was, mostly stone, of course, but a lot of those temples would use different types of clamping, iron clamps, to have all of the blocks sort of connecting to each other. some, later into Roman times, a lot of the roofs used to be timber, and then timber with some sort of tile or something. And so like by the construction method, you would arrive at sort of when this temple was either built or reconstructed or all of that. And so we were doing all that work. We were able to age this temple right around like 50 AD. It was Roman, it wasn't Greek. And we were able to reverse engineer all of that because of the construction method.
Whoa.
Which was super cool.
Yeah.
And so I became enthralled with this idea of like forensic architecture and everything you could do with all of this.
I'm right there with you.
But it, I think, very clearly created this connection for me between how we build with what we build. I remember this one story. We were able to find some wood. It wasn't the wood remains themselves that was gone, but the stones have been carved to receive the wood, and the type of wood spans that would have required for the structure gave us a pretty limited, let's say, sizing of what the original tree could have been. And so based on that, then this arborist that we were working with, that some other expert from some other university was like, well, based on where you are, the timber likely came from this area, which had to be upstream because usually they would move it through rivers, and so blah, blah, blah. And so we were even able to like sort of even guess, just how you do with a quarry, you understand which quarry the stone was come from. Maybe you could even guess where the wood was coming from. And that's, that like I was watching these people talk and put these papers together, and then you read them, it's like, oh my God, that's amazing.
Oh my God.
So it's just so fascinating. The whole thing was just incredible. And it was 2,000 years ago, right? And
yeah. That's amazing. It's also like the human ingenuity involved in all of these, even just, okay, let's use the river to move our lumber. It's just so clever.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. I love everything about that. The structural forensics, the history of it, but also the collaborative sciences coming together and creativity and science working side by side to unpack this kind of mystery. Man, I get why that was a formative experience for you.
Fascinating.
I am so glad you told me that story, because that really makes Canoa click into place for me. Now I understand why you're so passionate, especially when you said how we build with what we build. And I want to get to Canoa, but I think we have some highlights to go through before the founding of Canoa that also I'm doing the forensics now, that will also help us understand how you got to Canoa. So can you give me the sort of highlights tour and the big lessons and challenges in your creative trajectory? I know you started at Shop Architects and then founded Case, and then we have a big enchilada to deal with WeWork before the founding of Canoa. Run me through that.
Stories.
Yeah. Take me through it. I'm on the canoe. You're paddling and steering.
Okay. We'll come back to this, but the reason for the name, which of course means canoe in Spanish, is slow but far, is what we say internally.
That's beautiful. Oh, that's the literary professor coming through. Yeah, the language, the person who understands language through culture.
Yes, I moved to New York after Illinois, went to Parsons. That time at Parsons was actually super exciting because there was a lot of young practices that were working there. Shop was one of them. 2 or 3 of the partners were teaching there. I had 2 of them as professors. Parsons had this program that was called Design Workshop, where you would design something and then you would build it. And I had gone through that. And so this was my second time now being out in the field. So it was Greece. And then we built this one structure out in Brooklyn. And, I loved getting my hands dirty. I loved, again, that sort of connection to craft. I just kept sort of coming to it, which in architecture, sometimes it's hard because of the scale of it. There's a real separation between design and then making.
Yeah.
And what really drew me to Shop at the time was that they were really telling the story of the architect as maker again, where you could actually influence how things get built, and maybe as a little bit of a rejection of the 1980s sort of anti-liability sort of movement, they were saying, well, like, no, we're actually willing to take on some risks because it affords us design opportunities that would otherwise not be really possible. And so they took this course where we were designing a building system for a house that they were going to do in Aspen. And we were doing, all of the 3D design for this. We're trying to figure out how to build it.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, with their guidance and everything. The house didn't get built, but what was really fascinating about that is that this is probably my first time where the computer itself became this sort of crafting mechanism, this tool that we would use to sort of craft thing. And the reason for that is because the house was a house for somebody who loved skating. I think it was an ex-professional skater.
Okay.
And so it had all this curvature in it,
Yeah.
very much in the same way that you would have in a skate park.
Uh-huh.
And so solving all of that surfacing, like all the surface continuity and the structure behind it, and how do we carry it, how do we not carry it, that geometric problem was fascinating. And the right tool for the job in that moment was, now really getting into, 3D modeling and parametrics and all these kinds of things. And so I finally sort of found like the true use of it. And I was like, oh, okay, that connects. That makes sense.
Okay. And for context, where are we in time?
This is 2004.
2004. Okay.
Yeah. And so anyway, so we were doing that through a semester. Like I said, the house didn't get built, but then shop at the time was beginning to grow. They're moving out of their first office into their second, and they hired me and a couple of other people to help them, like all of the furniture build out for their new office. And so I was in my last year in grad school, but I was going there and working like weekends and whatnot. And just sort of hit it off with everybody there. They offered me a job after I graduated. And I found myself in a place where I think for the first time, there's a lot of like-minded people in the sense that this idea of how we do the work we do was probably just as important, if not more important than the work we were doing.
Yeah.
And they, all of the stuff that they were talking about in terms of like mass customization and the books that came out during that time. And it was a very exciting time to be there. There's just so much talent in those early days at Shop. It was amazing. I don't think I realized until much later that there's these moments when a group of people come together and it's just clear and it amplifies.
Yeah.
And those moments, because they are rare, I think one hopefully learns to look for them, because they don't have to happen just once. But if you don't seek them out, maybe they won't happen very often, if at all again. And so that for me was, I think, yet another sort of defining building block in my career, which was, how do I find myself in situations where I can sort of team up with the right group, right? Team up with the right group who will catapult us into something really fun, really exciting, incredibly educational. And that's sort of like a next growth spurt. Because what's really cool about these types of growth spurts is that they're about learning, right? They're about pushing boundaries and doing things. And those could happen at any age.
Yes. And actually, I think the first couple of them feel like they happen coincidentally or accidentally. But now, you said there's more agency involved, seeking out the situations that you want to find yourself in, but also creating the conditions and building the tools if you need to create those conditions.
That's exactly right. You design a context that affords this to be able to happen. And that like it won't happen also just magically. Like sometimes or another we stumble upon these things, but like once you do, I think we do have to have the presence of mind to recognize those things and then maybe pick it up and be like, oh, this is a thing. So I wanna go back to that moment though, because of all of the excitement and everything. There's one thing that happened during my time there that was very much formative, which was 2006, Katrina hit. And
oh, yes.
Yeah. And we were working on a competition for a new building at Tulane University, coincidentally. And then Katrina hits. We had just presented the final. And then as the hurricane comes through, of course, New Orleans is upended. Most of southwestern Mississippi is upended as well. Of course, the whole country sort of looking at this area. And we get a phone call from the school, somebody in Tulane, that the person who is going to be the main donor for the building in the competition was actually from Mississippi, and that the storm had just like directly hit her childhood home, and if we knew people who could go help, because everybody, of course, locally was either incredibly busy with first response or they were just worried about handling care with their families. And so they were sort of just trying to get people to.
Yeah.
And so to give them a lot of credit for this, the shop partners asked, like, is anybody interested in going down there to help? And so myself and my friend Reese, we raised our hands. We're like, we want to go. And then one of the engineers that was on that project as well, a structural engineer, he was on as well. And so we got on an airplane that she sent, packed up a bunch of hand tools into duffel bags and just like threw them into the airplane and then landed in Mississippi, took a car and like
You're
going,
like an
driving through the
architectural
dark.
EMT. Wow.
Well, what was really interesting there is that now it came from the other side, which it was just like now it's like sort of like disaster relief.
Yeah.
What is the thing you need on day one? What is the thing you need on day 7? What is the thing you need on like month 3? What's the thing you need 3 years from now? And that sort of building up from scratch as opposed to forensic is just a different perspective. But yet again, it was with this thing where you're just like, okay, we're now back in the field for the third time. I have this connection between like how we make things and what people need. And like that became also just like energizing to such a degree because, well, first of all, like the level of destruction was incredible. I had never seen anything like that.
Yeah.
You'd tear up randomly. You'd be like driving on the road and literally just tears starts coming down your face.
I actually did a little bit of reconstruction after there too. And I know what you're talking about. It was so evident everywhere you went, just that how many lives had been completely devastated. And it was very emotional.
Incredibly so. For me, it was maybe like the first very hard and very real connection to weather and climate and how us as architects do have a role to play in all of this. It's not this sort of foreign thing that happens outside of us, but
a responsibility even.
That's right. And seeing firsthand that many, many, many of the issues were actually beyond the storm itself. It was the issues that happened because the infrastructure had been either lacking or designed in such a way. And so there's a very, very real connection to how buildings can make things much worse as well if they're not done properly or if they're not done with these kinds of things in mind. And so, of course, we have to consider what we're designing for. And maybe in that case, those buildings were not designed for that. That's okay. But it's like, what do we do next?
Yes.
Became the real sort of clear answer. And so we did what we could. I spent just a few weeks there. Reese spent almost a year there. We built a community center, simple things like a laundromat, right? Like a hair salon, like the things that people just needed every day to feel like there was some semblance of a common life. And all of it was done with us seeing what we could get in terms of materials and labor.
Okay.
Because everybody was busy doing things.
Right.
And so
you had to be extra resourceful. Yeah.
Yeah. So you have to do what you do what you can and you figure it out and you get there. That was a much more visceral connection to tooling and things like that, because we have pictures of us sleeping on the trailer on site and then like the next morning, like tying rebar because the person who was going to come out and tie the rebar didn't show up. And you have a concrete truck coming the next day. It's just like, okay, you got to tie the rebar. Otherwise this thing's not going to work, and you figure it out. And so, in a way you become, architects will never tell you this, but they're like massively jealous of furniture designers because
Oh,
you
I
get
know
to
that.
you
Totally.
you get to touch and feel like the
Yes.
detail and the and the rounding and the connection and all these things and
Oh, it's
like
embodied material knowledge.
yeah,
Yeah.
and that's why we love 3D modeling because that's the closest we get. And and so those instances where you get to go out in there in the field and you touch and you feel the material, and you're like, oh, I'm tying the rebar. It's like, oh, like maybe I designed something really stupid and it looked good on paper. Well, this is not the way that should have been done.
Yeah.
You gain a lot of that empathy, which is pretty wonderful. But I like to tell this story because I think my main takeaway there it was just really how much designers, architects, interior designers, industrial designers, how much those of us designers whose core job is to negotiate what I like to call like the human planet interface. Like that's what we do. And if
Yeah.
we don't do it right, our planet suffers and people suffer. And that's it. Like, and I was just like, okay, like I
Yeah.
finally understood this thing that we do to be more so than just like, do I like this or do I not like this? It has purpose that hopefully lives on beyond my lifetime, and that we should consider that.
Yes.
And so I kind of like refell in love with architecture all over again in a very different way and maybe more mature way than I had when I was a teenager.
I love that.
And so I just began to understand, I think, design as generally one of the clearest manifestations of our own ingenuity as a species. And I also began to understand it as this thing where, like, again, generally speaking, design is can be really good. It can be a force for good. It can be an agent for good, for each other, for our planet as well.
Yes.
And if we think about it that way, then there's so much we could do. And so then going back to shop and all this stuff, and like we were like super tool nerds, right? Like doing all kinds of different things. We're doing really cool stuff. This sort of became the genesis of Case, which was our first company, which is to say, look, we believe software as a whole will have a fundamental impact on how much design we can do.
Mm-hmm.
Because the general constraint that design had in the world was great, you're a phenomenal designer, but your expertise is bound to whomever the highest bidder is to your 1 hour of availability.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so we can only do so much work, and whatever project wins or whatever whoever's paying us the most, that's what we do. And so we said software should have the ability to just massively expand our ability to do design work, not to do better. Like, let's just leave the qualifiers out of it, just to do more of it. If we consider the fact that most of our problems in the world today are environmental in nature, one should logically then see that maybe design can help some of those things, right? Like housing or access to water or all of these kinds of things. And so
Mm-hmm.
more design by the experts that we do have should equal a good thing. And we fundamentally believe that software was a way for us to amplify ourselves. And I think in a way we were right. Maybe I don't think it's sort of hit the explosion that we had expected, or maybe it has in other ways, but that's the genesis of Case, where we said we believe that there's now a whole new part of practice that has to do with software tooling
Mm-hmm.
for designers, architects, engineers, interior designers, builders who just need to do more. And they need to do more, and they need to do more, and they need to do more. And that was the genesis of that company. I was 27, 28 when we started that.
So Case was acquired by WeWork, and then begins this essentially rocket launch, kind of, right? Like into, I don't know, just the scale of it is still just mind blowing. Can you talk to me about that chapter?
So 2012, 13, Case starts working for WeWork on some projects. We were helping them build some software tooling to, just little optimizations for, design to procurement or design to fabrication or these kinds of things that were necessary for them to just move faster. Those things were going well. We were growing, they were growing. And about a year or so into that relationship, they had raised more money. They now had the money to expand from, say, 10 locations to a couple of hundred. And they said, look, there's not a lot of people out there who both know the industry and they also know technology.
Yeah.
And so why don't you guys come here? We'd gotten a couple of other offers in the past for acquisition. I think the reason why we ended up taking this one was because we weren't going to be an attachment to the bigger thing, right? Like they came and said, you guys come do it. Like,
Ah.
and this was core business. They were sort of giving us the keys to the car and say, like, here's a bunch of money.
Yeah.
And we trust you to do this. And to give them credit at the time, they gave us that trust. And so it was super fun and super interesting and totally crazy and all of those things at once.
Bananas.
Completely bananas.
Like 500 locations in 30 different countries, like $250 million per year of FF&E. Like, did I get those numbers right? Because that's...
Yeah, and that's just FF&E. We did everything. Like there was more than $1 billion of CapEx investment probably yearly. Yeah, we did everything from upgrading elevators to HVAC systems to windows. And then, of course, all of the interiors, which was the core of the product, which is all that fit and finish that happens at the end, which was really, I think, what made the product. But all of the architecture behind it that allowed that context to exist also had to happen.
So on a personal level, did you just impress the fuck out of yourself, like being able to pull that off? I mean, you can say it now after, I mean, because you probably really did have to push yourself.
Yeah.
Like almost like a Olympian or something, like, because the speed of it was also intense.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe I'm just really hard on myself. My general look back at my time at WeWork was that I could have done more.
I can't wrap my head around that.
Because not more buildings, but there's always these little things that, I mean, and this is actually a great connector to why ultimately then we started Canoa. But like, there was a lot of things we were doing really well.
Mm-hmm.
We had built an amazing team. We had scaled that team globally. We were building buildings in 30 different, not just 30 cities, it was 30 different languages, 30 different construction codes, right? Like, and retrofitting all of these buildings. We'd like to say like we were sort of breathing new life into buildings that had seen severe underinvestment for decades. And you're just basically giving them another 50 years of new life. All of that felt really good.
Yes.
But there was also a lot of things that we just wanted to do and didn't get to. And so I think you talk to a lot of people at WeWork that were part of design and construction group will probably tell you that, yes, of course, in context, what happened was amazing.
Mm-hmm.
But we also all probably hold a little bit of like that, like, it just could have been so much more because it was right there. And then the whole thing collapsed.
Right.
and there's so much more that could have been done. And it ended up not happening. The company scaled so much, it just got like torn apart. Like it got spread so thin, then of course mismanagement and everything else that came up through it. And then the thing collapsed. But aside from what, you see other of these companies collapse, the core product here was actually fine. Right. It's all of the frothiness around it that was not, because we had a design specification. Think about like Apple retail, for example, right? Like, because then when you go buy door hardware, you don't buy it one project at a time. You buy it a year's worth.
Yeah.
And then you distribute because you get prices that are 70, 80, 90% lower than you would otherwise.
Right.
And so as this machine was getting going, it just consumed all of this stuff. But any of that material didn't get routed properly, just get lost. Right. And so now going back to, like when we say we could have done more, I've told this story once or twice before, but like, I'm in LA visiting a job site, and we come off of an exit, and on the side of the exit, there's an office chair, and I can tell you it's an H&I chair.
Recognize it as one of your own.
I was like, that's a WeWork chair.
Oh,
and
no.
I was like, I did that. I put this piece of plastic on the side of the road, and that like pained me. And going back again to this idea of like, our design decisions matter. Of course they matter. We decided to bring this into the world and we should be responsible for it. And this is one of those moments where I was just like, oh, like, again, for as much good work as we were doing, this is where things clearly began to split at the seams. It's like, we're not on top of things as much as maybe we think we are, and we need to figure some things out.
So I think this is a great place to talk about how Canoa comes into the picture.
Yeah, so 2018, throughout that whole year, I was at WeWork that whole year, but really throughout that year, I was super burnt out. I was beginning to have some health issues. On top of all of that, at some point we're in a clip where we're opening something like 15 to 20 buildings a month globally. And so managing all of that, it was just a huge, huge, huge amount of work. And then they also were trying to launch completely new products like, We Live and We Grow and all of these other things. And so I kept saying, like, my core job is WeWork. I don't want anything else. I don't want anything else. I don't want anything else. But because of the governance structure of the company wasn't keeping up to date to like how our product is being developed, I inevitably kept getting pulled into lots of different things and meetings and conversations. And anyway, I wasn't enjoying doing 2 or 3 jobs at once. I wasn't doing as good a job as I wanted to. And frankly, a lot of what I was excited about, which was that sort of creative freedom that comes with early stage. WeWork was no longer early stage. We had 12,000 employees, right? And so a lot of my time was meetings and spreadsheets and not really doing a lot of crafting, if you will. So I think in the back of my mind, I was just like, maybe I'm sort of ready to, like, let's call this rocket ship launched. let's go build a new one. And then by the end of that year, I decided to leave. I took a year off. I had 2 young kids at home.
I'm happy to hear that. I feel like your nervous system probably needed a break.
I needed it.
Yeah.
I needed to get healthy again. I was a bit of a mess from that perspective.
Okay.
I learned that I'm a sprinter and not a marathoner. And so whenever I sink my teeth into something, I just go. And I'm 110% on it until I can't go anymore.
Yeah.
And then, I'll rest for a while and then I can sprint again.
Okay. Good to know about yourself. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that period sort of taught me that. And then, so I took a year off, and then right at the end of 2019, I was going really deep on 2 problems that I was super passionate about. One of them was small scale housing. And the other one was really more on the tooling side. It was, let's say, interior design tooling.
Mm-hmm.
One of my biggest takeaways after Case and WeWork was just how incredibly poor the tooling is around interior design and FF&E in general. This idea that like the tools we have to use are borrowed from either ground up construction, or worse, they're borrowed from just generic tooling that may or may not be 100% applicable to us. And so like there's all of these design fields that have very specific tooling, like, web is different than print, which is different than like media, which is different than 3D. Mm-hmm. And then interior design is like, oh, just use Miro. It's like the amount of money this industry moves, and there's so little, right? Like even tools like SketchUp or Revit, like they weren't made for this, right? And so there's limitations even there. And so and we felt it, of course, head on. This is one of the, the story of that chair, like with WeWork, like this is one of those examples. And so you have this very clear divide in the design world where as you go from the scale of the architecture to the human scale, that fit and finish scale that turns a blank room into a usable space, like a baby's room or an office or whatever, that scale is just completely unattended by tooling. And so super passionate about that. And I don't know. So I was like, okay, I'd done services in my career. I had done product in my career. I was like, I need to try out the SaaS thing.
Yes.
I'm going to go sell software on a monthly subscription and see how that works. And that's really how Canoa came about, is just I put aside the housing thing because it's just, housing is just it's a wonderful, horrible mess of a problem.
Indeed.
And I was like, I'm not naive enough to think that, one company can really put too much of a dent in it. I think on a personal level, I'm going to continue to follow it. But I think that like, where can I be most impactful? It's like, okay, I got to get back to tooling. I got to get back to like celebrating the craft that is design and hopefully build something that many, many, many people can do so that many people can use so that they can then go out into the world and do more design.
So they can scale up their own services, their own good intentions.
Yeah, that's right. And so probably above all, one of the key takeaways is that in the world of interior design, so much of what we do is product research, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's just
Sourcing and specifying
sourcing and
yeah.
there's just so much of this, right? Like an architect can put up a wall and create a performance specification that could be fulfilled by 3 or 4 different products constructed in a very particular way. And interior designer needs to be specific, more specific, and say, no, I don't want the light to only just perform at this level of say of lighting. I want it like I need to be this light, and I need to be this, and I need to be this, and I need to be this, because there's a of course an aesthetic requirement and all of those things as well. And so we felt like the fact that most of the tooling, if not all of the tooling that we use, has no intrinsic sort of database backing. There's no sort of concentrated way in which our software helps us manage all of this information so we can design easier.
Right.
Just felt like a gap, right? Like the core benefit of a Revit, if you will, in the architectural world is that it has a database inside of it that you can create a database for your building of like, here's all the stuff in your building.
Mm-hmm.
So the objective with this was to say, if we're going to start a tool today that wanted to make the process of interiors easier in 2020, which was the time, what would that look like? And of course, the answer has to be different than if you were to ask that question in 1990 or 1980, which is where most of the most popular tools we use today were founded.
Yes.
Right. So 30 years on, technology affords you all kinds of different opportunities than it would have 30 years ago. And so what are those things? And so we tend to bias focusing on the things that will really make us an accessory to or a complement to those core tools. Not because we say like, look, we eventually will get there as well, but like, what are the things you cannot do with those tools today? And that's really where the complement ends up being a real benefit.
And from what I understand, that database is continually growing and it's rich with all of the information that a designer would need to know about the products they're specifying, including lead times, materials, specifications, shipping, carbon footprint. And so then having that information at their fingertips and then stored within, let's say, their design plan or their mood board, or it helps them make more informed choices. And it updates on its own, right? So they don't have to keep tracking this information down. It stays current, which is amazing. And then and then these are also shareable. So you can get client feedback or you can collaborate, and all of this information is contained within. And what are the limits?
I mean, well, I think you hit the nail on the head on, let's say, the core tension and opportunity that we try to go after. And we like to say it's the moment a designer and a product meet.
Uh-huh.
A link is established. And so our only job is to make sure that that link is stable. And so we say, what are the most popular tools that interior designers use today? It's like, you ask somebody, be like, oh, I don't know, SketchUp. It's like, it's Pinterest, bar none. Because when they take a step back and they're like, well, actually, the first tool that I open up in the morning, other than maybe Instagram, is Pinterest. And so what have they done really well? And what they've done really well is that they have really honed in on what we call the sort of our core need to curate the world. Mm-hmm. Right? Like there's like, I need to save things, but I need to save my things, not somebody else's, right?
Yeah.
Like my things. And then it just stays there. And then, of course, you use that for inspiration. You use that for your projects. Great. What this teaches us is that the world in 2024, the world of the internet, and I hate that I have to say it that way, but like our industry is that far behind, has so much wonderful information out there, right? Like there's just so much content. There's so many brands. There's so many websites. There's just so much.
Mm-hmm.
And our design tools don't tie into any of it.
Yep.
Our design tools are desktop software that don't even know the internet exists. And so what we said is like, why would we have this concept where I'm doing all this stuff and then I have a materials library over there and I can go to it physically and then I can come back and then if I created a link there, that link is immediately severed because there's no sort of, it was like, this is where technology can actually help. Don't make the renderings for me. Who like,
Yeah.
who cares? Like, that's the fun stuff. Like, help me say that if I'm interested in this such and such product or paint or finish or whatever, and I am evaluating it next to three other ones, and I've decided to bring that into my design space, yeah, retain a link and keep me updated on what's happening with those products over time. So I don't have to keep having to go out and fetch this. So I'm not going to stumble over myself when I go to make my final presentation. And I didn't even know that that product is now discontinued. And what I just presented to you, sorry, I'm going to have to make a change here. And it wasn't even intentional. Like we make ourselves look bad. And so like, and this is why we're browser based as well. It's like being in the browser and being connected into the internet gives us tremendous opportunity. And so what was our first integration? Pinterest. It's like, yeah, bring in your Pinterest because Pinterest is wonderful. And then as you go from collecting things from the world and you need to design things, it's like, okay, when we need to bring reality into these things. And so we help you, go walk through that journey. But you asked, what are the limits? I don't know. But what's happened now that's really cool is that we want to get, like, let's call it unstructured data from the world. Pinterest and things like that. Well, what's happening now that's really cool is that brands are like, that's awesome, but we want like the highest level, cleanest data. And so we've over the last year or so, we've been bringing on, we call, publishers, which are brands that actually publish their own data in their catalogs. And so what we can help you do is to say, is like, if you bring in a chair and we can identify that chair, we now have all of the information from the brand directly. And so now all of a sudden, your materials library is now a digital materials library that is real time from the brand directly, not from anybody else. And as that chair updates or doesn't update or whatever, you should be notified of it. And that's as simple as that. And so our objective is that, of course, we would have all the brands on there, which maybe is vast, but why not? All the brands, all the paints, all the finishes, all of the surfacing, all of the lighting, so that you are able to focus more time on deciding what is appropriate for your project, for your client, for that space, and not copying and pasting data that doesn't really help anybody. So that's where we feel technology really should be focused on. And that's where the tooling, you talked about tooling and craft making, like this is a better knife. It's just a better knife, but we still need to cut, you still need to make the sushi. I don't know, but use a better knife. That's
it's auto sharpening.
And so our only job, toolmakers, is to give you as much information, as high fidelity information as we can, as early as possible in the process, so that you can make better decisions and you can iterate further and you can reach that nth iteration as opposed to only 2 or 3.
So you are like, I know there's a lot of panic around AI usurping designers' jobs, but this is the opposite of that. Instead of taking and automating what designers do, you're just automating not the part of them that makes them a designer. You're automating the parts that suck up their time that make them not a designer so that they can go out into the world and do more of their good work as a designer. They can scale that up more effectively, more efficiently, make it more pleasant.
Yeah.
And make better choices around sustainability.
And make better choices. So many of the choices we make as designers, I had a professor that used to, it's like design is like research. You just keep going. It's never ending, right?
Yeah.
And there's a lot of truth to that in the sense that most projects are only defined by some time boundary, which is what the budget allows and the time boundary. But you could probably keep going and just continue to make it better. A lot of that has to do with just as the cyclical process of design happens, you unearth, let's say, information, which then yields opportunities that maybe would not have been clear 2 steps before. And it has nothing to do with being a good designer or a bad designer. It just has to do with how quickly can you get to like the core of that optimization and optimization and optimization and optimization. And we feel there is a gross amount of our time today that is wasted, frankly, with things that technology could do an incredibly good job at, whereas our time to make judgments
Yes.
can be freed up to make more judgments. Because if we get to a project that allows us to make 100 decisions deep versus 10 decisions deep, that'll just be a better project.
Yep. That makes perfect sense. It's sort of like steroids for your good judgment.
Yeah, that's it.
Well, steroids has a bad connotation, but super fruits.
It's maybe what's happened in many other professions. I don't know. I would say maybe music, for example, or even writing today, machines can make music now.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. And they have been able to for some time. And that's okay. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with it. I'm not gonna have a moral discussion around this. What we do know is that the best creations have a time and a place and a context. And our ability, let's say, to make those things, to create those things, I think is one of those things that really makes us most human, is that the whole concept of creation is to make something that didn't exist before, which it may or may not be just a reshaping of what existed in the past. What really connects us to anything that is, design related, even engineering solutions, all these kinds of things, is that there's a problem that needs to be solved. That problem is being solved by a particular team in a particular context of time with a particular budget. All of that creates a particular solution that is unique, and it's wonderful in and of itself. And I'm not sure you can predict every possible iteration of these things. And so I consider myself like I said, I'm a tool builder. So technology, I'm not afraid of it. I think it's wonderful. I think it's quirky. I think it makes lots of bad stuff. But I also think it's very clear where technology can help us and where it can't. If we need to redevelop a town or something like that, where real humans come in and there's real environmental issues, and we want it to last 300 years and all of these kinds of things, then I'd much prefer the judgment of some really good thinkers who are going to consider all of those variables in a very human way.
I'm right there with you. And I think that was a beautiful way to sharpen the pencil, put a real point on it. This has been really, really interesting. Thank you so much. And thank you for taking me all the way through some of the more fascinating chapters of your life. I've really enjoyed learning how you think and how you build. I'm excited for Canoa. I think it seems like a very valuable, potentially game-changing tool in the design industry that could cut down on a lot of waste, expand a lot of good judgment, and make people's creativity stretch even further and further. So, thanks.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for having me. This was fun.
Hey, thanks so much for listening. For a transcript of this episode and more about Federico, including links and images of his work, head to our website, cleverpodcast.com. While you're there, sign up for our free Substack newsletter, which includes news, announcements, and a bonus Q&A from our guests. If you like Clever, there are a number of ways you can support us. Start by completing our listener survey at the link in the description. Share Clever with your friends, leave us a 5-star rating or a kind review, and hit the follow or subscribe button in your podcast app so that our new episodes will turn up in your feed. We love to hear from you on LinkedIn, Instagram, and X. You can find us at Clever Podcast, and you can find me at Amy Devers. Clever is hosted and produced by me, Amy Devers, with editing by Mark Zurowinski, production assistance from Alana Nevins and Anushka Stefan, and music by L1011. Clever is a proud member of the Surround Podcast Network. Visit surroundpodcasts.com to discover more of the architecture and design industry's premier shows.
Architects will never tell you this, but they're massively jealous of furniture designers.